We'll now go on to the next session on more evidence for driving action, collecting data with a survivor-centered approach. So after this very short summary of UniSAFE's results, we now want to share some of the learnings from UniSAFE research, and more specifically from the work performed in data collection. Its large-scale survey and interviews with researchers, completed with experience from a similar survey at national level in Sweden. So I'd like to call our moderator here on our small stage. Anke Lipinsky is Senior Researcher at GESIS Leibniz Institute for the Social Sciences, Department Data and Research on Society. She has extensive experience in the application of qualitative and quantitative social science methods in the field of gender inequalities and related topics in higher education and research. Dr. Lipinsky is the PI for UniSAFE's cross-cultural online survey in research-performing organizations.
Okay, thanks a lot, Colette. Thank you so much. My pronoun is she, her. I know I'm privileged. And we're now entering into even more evidence for driving action. And the day yesterday was very full. There was a lot of things actually that we learned and we heard about how evidence is really the backbone in policy development. And I think we heard a lot of really encouraging new developments, which suggests actually that in the near future there will be even more need for data and more data collections, which is good. So we assume we are doing the right things in collecting evidence and collecting data, but we also need to ask ourselves, are we doing things right? So how are we collecting the data? And do we center the participants' needs in our studies all the time? And this is actually, and saying this, I would like to invite you to slow down a bit your appetite for new information and to enter into this reflexive mode. And I'm totally happy to welcome to the stage three esteemed colleagues of the, we've been collaborating in the UniSAFE project. So the first speaker is Dr. Vilana Pilinkaite. She works as a research fellow on gender plus issues in the Lithuanian Center for Social Sciences in the Institute for Sociology. And in UniSAFE, she was responsible for the task on individual interviews with researchers at higher risk to being exposed to gender-based violence in academia. I welcome Vilana to the stage. Okay. So this is not working. We need to take the computer.
Thank you. So thank you very much, Anke, for the introduction, and it's really great honor and pleasure to speak to you today. And I am taking an opportunity to thank all the partners in the consortium who contributed in doing this research in UniSAFE. Collecting data, doing interviews, sharing their reflection, and that was a huge learning process during the whole UniSAFE project. So I will skip all methodologies because there is no time, but I will be glad to answer any questions if on methodology will come up. And I will more speak about why we need to collect individual data from the individual interviews and what this data gives to us and how it can improve or contribute to improvement of the policies. So yesterday and also in quantitative research in UniSAFE, what we did, we noticed that reporting is very, very low. That people are not willing to report. And basically, on the one hand, we see that institutions relying on the data that, well, reporting is low, So maybe not so much prevalences in our institutions, so maybe we do not have to invest more. But giving an opportunity for the voices of individual survivors, victims, and bystanders, we can see a lot of evidence which are not coming to the reporting. So why it's, give the voice for the survivors, bystanders, and victims is important, that, it gives them confidence that their voice is important, that it is heard on the one hand. On the other hand, it builds not only confidence about for the survivors, but also it provides certain hope, because mainly all the interviewees who shared their stories, they were coming, telling their stories with the hope that this, their evidences, the information they're providing will be somehow transformed for the future actions for the universities, that the universities will implement the measures which are important for the individuals. So I am putting some, quotes from the interviews just to illustrate that, this, giving the voice is important for the individuals, just, that their stories would be heard, trusted, that the evidence they present are credible, and that it would be somehow transformed to the some policy actions or measures. Again, why it is important to talk about and to give the voice for the individuals, because it also shifts the responsibility from an individual to more institutional responsibility. We can identify what is lacking in the institutions, and basically we can see what is lacking in the structures, or is it some behaviors, or is it attitudes that makes problematic for the institutions to take responsibility and to bring policies and implement those policies. And here again, I put some policy that, some quotes, sorry, that, that usually institutions, they have policies, or they have some protocols, or they have some measures. But as many of the individuals were telling that, well, university takes it a very low profile, or they are not seeing it as important to implement, or there is lack of will, or a lot of resistance that we saw in case studies, or yesterday when we talked about. So those individual stories that they shows why even individuals are not thinking about going to report, because there are other evidences like structures, behaviors, and attitudes that are not even taken into consideration. And also about the consequences. I mean that, usually universities are afraid of the negative consequences and prestige. But disclosing the story, the incidences, what interviews told us, basically, and if the institution takes certain measures, it weighs, or it gives a positive consequence for the university, because it matters for the university. But as many individual interviews showed, that institutions are willing to somehow hide the incidences, not to speak about this, not to trust that it was something happening, and basically it also provokes certain negative consequences, because people talk inside informally, and then they identify with whom they don't want to work, with whom they are not willing to continue their careers. There is also kind of informal gatherings, so that students are also start to raise their voices. So hiding, not taking seriously these issues of, bringing political will to combat gender-based violence in the university, basically it has, in a long term, very negative consequences for the university. And what data disclosed for us, and how the stories can, improve the policies. So one of the main, I think that outcomes of this individual interviews, that we see that individual interviews provide us very nuanced knowledge. What does it mean, gender-based violence? It is, what does it mean, this abuse of power? How it works, in which context it works. So, well, basically we're collecting evidence why this reporting is not taken by the individuals, and it shows how this manipulation of power works. It shows that, well, very often individuals even do not recognize that they are already trapped in violence, because the supervisor or somebody who is having more power asked to do an extra work, to invited to write together publication, and then asking more and more your engagement without any crediting for the work you do. Then you are like engaged because well, there were some proposals, but then you were harassed, or you are like well, in other way more somehow swept out of the scene. So like it takes a lot of time when you are like recognizing that something happens with you, and when you're already trapped in this power abuse game, it's then difficult very much to get out of the game. And this individual interviews gives a lot of knowledge how these power games work, who are the perpetrators. Then we can recognize who is abusing the power, and then we know that it is basically mainly supervisors or managers who has this power and that can execute it, but also the networks that support these perpetrators, and also the well, managers or those who has this power. And on the other hand, it also shows that what are the attitudes that are very widely spread in that environment, that the power abuse could be tolerated. So like homophobia, sexism, there's so much widespread that even having this evidence, not everybody would go and report for the commission or committee, because still it is not in the protocol that this should be taken so seriously. But on the other hand, it gives a lot for the institution where policies are missing in that institution. For example, if we know that there are attitudes widely spread in the university, which are discriminatory, sexist, homophobic, then the prevention, it can bring those very evidence-based messages to the prevention actions. That it would be powerful for the the prevention campaign, because it is recognizable among the audience who is experiencing this this kind of misbehaviors every day. It also gives certain evidence how protection should be also implemented, because usually what individual interviews says us that there is no respect, like no trust that institution will take this, the case very seriously, and it will be so resolved in a way that it will be justice for the victim and also accountability for the perpetrator. There is no feedback how the case is resolved. For example, if committee took the decisions, usually those who submitted complaint are not getting the feedback, and this is very clear that why people are restrained to report and to disclose what happened with them. So then you can collect a lot of evidence why services are not working, or if they are like accessible but they are not affordable, or and there are many details. So just to sum up, it's not enough to give the voice for the victims, but also to hear those voices and to take them very seriously, because then we're getting very nuanced knowledge about where the problem is located. Is it in the structures, in behavior, and or in attitudes? This helps to design more targeted actions for the universities that would tackle those very clear problems, and it also will strengthen responsibilities to create safe and inclusive environment, and it will be very positive consequences and outcome for the universities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vilana. So we learn that from individual narratives, we learn about the functioning and working of policies and measures, and that we need to make sure to avoid re-traumatization of people participating. The next speaker is Claudia Schredl. She's a scientific associate at GESIS. She's working in UniSAFE, specifically on the quantitative survey. Her research interests cover gender equality policy in the EU and institutional change in universities, gender-based violence in academia, and feminist institutionalism. She's also a doctorate candidate at Paderborn University in sociology, and she writes her thesis on essentialism in gender policies in universities. She will talk about collecting survey data on gender-based violence with a survivor-centered approach at organizational level. Okay, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Anke. Yes, so today I will present and talk not about UniSAFE survey results, which you can find on a project website and many publications that are in the pipeline, so stay tuned and stay informed. I will focus on collecting survey data on gender-based violence with a survivor-centered approach at organizational level, and we'll dive into what we mean by survivor-centered in a minute. But first of all, why do we need to carry out organizational surveys on gender-based violence, and how do we do that then survivor-centered? We need organizational surveys. I think I'm now in a room with many people who know why, but I want to stress those 3 points because it provides the evidence of the extent of the issue at your organizational level, so at your institution. And as we've heard yesterday, evidence provides then legitimation for having more gender equality measures and more actions. Second, it allows for evidence-based policy development and tailor-made measures for your organization. So you know what kind of, for example, what forms of gender-based violence are most prevalent, which groups are most affected, and this allows you to have a tailor-made approach to gender-based violence at your organization. And third, it can also be used to raise awareness about gender-based violence in academic institutions. Many people still associate gender-based violence with sexual violence and sexual harassment only, but they're not aware of other more emerging forms like psychological violence or economic violence. So this is a great opportunity also to raise awareness. And what is a survivor-centered approach when it comes to surveys? As mentioned by my colleague Anne-Laure, quantitative methods and having a more intersectional approach, but also survivor-centered, there are some challenges there. But what we recommend is to empower the respondents. I will come more in detail on this part in the next slide. To avoid victim blaming in measurement constructs and individualization of a systematic issue of gender-based violence. What do I mean here? Many surveys or previous surveys focus a lot on, for example, alcohol or drug consumption of the victims or the perpetrators. But in the end, it's not about an individual problem that happens when you go out and drink too much or something. It's a systematic issue, and we have a lot of problems in the organizational structures that allow for power abuse and gender-based violence. And third, it should address all genders. I'd like to pause here for a minute because many surveys and also on a policy-making level and everyday discussions, we talk about gender-based violence affecting women. Yes, it affects women strongly, but we also have non-binary persons that we want to include and trans persons, and also men can suffer from gender-based violence. So we need to have to come back to the keynote yesterday, to have like an inclusive, integrated approach, we need to also address all genders. And now, how can you carry out the organizational survey with the survivor-centered approach? First and foremost, it should be anonymous. This has like two pillars. First, it should be sent out in an anonymous way, so that, for example, sending out emails to your staff members and students, or, for example, allowing to enter to the survey via the intranet page, but without like any way to really follow up who filled out the survey. On the second part, it's also important when you present the results to consider that re-identification is possible if you combine several socio-demographic categories. For example, if I know the sexual orientation, the gender identity, maybe the age, and then maybe the faculty, it might be not that difficult to know who this person is. So it then, of course, depends on the size of your institution, how many staff members or students you have, but it's important to keep that in mind. Second, trigger warnings. Trigger warnings, here I mean that, for example, in the beginning of the survey, welcome page and the informed consent, you state this survey is about gender-based violence, and provide also a definition so that people know, like the respondents know what kind of questions might come up, what kind of issue this is. And also throughout the survey, it's important, before you ask, for example, prevalence questions, to remind the respondents that now we're talking about this topic, so they can still get out if they don't feel comfortable. This goes hand in hand also with providing information on helplines and provision of services at national, regional, and organizational level at several points of the survey. So not many times it happens, it's in the beginning, in the informed consent, there's a small link, and then you go into the survey and you don't really know, okay, how do I get back there? So it's important to have those kind of informations really throughout the survey and at several points, and in an easy way for the respondents so they can just click on it. We also provided, actually, since we carried out UniSAFE surveys in several countries, we actually collected a lot of information, and thanks to all people who are here in the room who are also helping us from all the organizations to collect this information. And you can find this actually on the website of UniSAFE. Fourth, options to opt out and opt in when answering the survey questions. With this, I mean that respondents are not forced to answer the question. There are several ways to do this. For example, you can offer a prefer not to say option. For example, for socio-demographic questions where you really need the answer to then later analyze the data, but you can still offer a prefer not to say. And on the other hand side, you can also, for example, in the UniSAFE survey for the prevalence question, we allowed them to say, okay, I don't want to answer questions to this on this form of gender-based violence, I say prefer not to say, and they can just continue with the survey. And finally, the last point, it's not really a survivor-centered approach in itself, but I'd like to remind everyone, and it's really important for all surveys to ensure GDPR compliance, including comprehensive information on data protection and contact details. We had colleagues from the Lithuanian University actually supporting us here, Katarzyna. And yeah, it's important for all surveys, but of course, when it comes to a sensitive topic, like gender-based violence, it's in particular important. And with this, I already come to my key messages. So first of all, organizational surveys with a survivor-centered approach, they provide evidence, and evidence supports that gender-based violence is a systematic issue in academic institutions, and we have to continue the hard work on this. Second, organizational surveys show the extent of the issue. They raise the awareness of gender-based violence, and they give survivors a voice, as already mentioned by Vilana. It's on one hand interviews, but also with the survey, we can also provide a voice to survivors. And finally, organizational surveys with a survivor-centered approach empower the respondents. In a sense, that's why we said survivor-centered. It empowers them, gives them the opportunity to answer the questions they would like to answer to, and to opt out, opt in, and to provide a voice. Finally, I forgot that in the beginning, of course, the UniSAFE survey was developed and carried out with a lot of help, like from the UniSAFE project team, but also from all institutions that were volunteering to participate in the survey. So thank you a lot for that. You find more information for how we carried out the approach in the survey in the toolkit on the prevalence section, which was already presented by our colleague Alain. And then I also added a few references to our method report and the codebook and the questionnaire of the UniSAFE survey, which can be reused and is now already published and available on the GESIS data archive site. And with this, I end, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Claudia. So we know already from qualitative research and also quantitative research there are options to give control and power to the research participants, which is super important. We have another example now from a quantitative study from our colleague Fredrik Bondestam. He's the director of the Swedish Secretariat for Gender Research at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. He's a member of the UniSAFE survey team and had a crucial role in the development of the 2021 Swedish National Survey on Sexual Harassment and Sexual Violence in Academia. And I hope after the talk we will also have time for questions here in the audience, but also online. Fredrik will talk about implementing the survivor-centered survey development in the case of Sweden. The floor is yours.
So thank you, Anke, thank you, Claudia and Vilana, for preparing the floor on this important subject, and thank you all of you for participating. I think this time is flying. We have quite short time, but I want to continue on the reflections done by Claudia on the importance of using a survivor-centered approach when developing surveys on gender-based violence. And I will try to include some experience that has been done, part of the team doing the national survey on sexual harassment and sexual violence in the Swedish context in 2021. But I will also, comment on being part of the survey team here in the UniSAFE context. And just as a starting point for these reflections, I think it's important to define the concepts at stake, that is the survivor-centered approach, as simple as possible. And it seems quite straightforward when you look at the definitions, I think. So first, what could be defined as a victim survivor-centered approach is to try to place the rights and the wishes and the needs and the safety and the dignity and well-being of all victims and survivors at the center of all measures and activities when developing and disseminating a survey in this kind of process. That seems quite self-evident in a sense, and I will soon start to reflect on the problems and challenges that you face doing this. But I also think it's important to mention the trauma-informed approach that is also needed when doing surveys on gender-based violence. And this implies, for example, to always ensure some kind of physical and emotional safety of all respondents to a survey. And it can mean enabling safe co-creation of the survey in itself. That was actually happening in the Swedish example. And it's also about actively resisting or avoiding the risk of re-traumatization when developing and disseminating a survey, as well as in the process of analyzing and publishing results. So in this context, I think it's important to stress that survivors of violence and victims of violence are not always the same. They can really be different positions. For example, survivors are often in the process of recovering from trauma, whereas victims are often in the midst of experiencing trauma. And in both cases, this can be ongoing processes with or without an understanding of experiences done defined by themselves as violence. So this is really a concept that is multi-layered in my understanding. And in terms of the trauma-informed approach, I think it's yet an aspect where the co-creation of, for example, items used in a survey is really an important part. And this means paying really close attention to the use of language in surveys, the way information on the survey is disseminated, formulated, and made available for respondents, but also in the sense that research is trying to always take responsibility for respondent safety by ensuring provision of services and, providing support when necessary. And this, I think this is also really important, that a survivor-centered approach is not a approach, it's not a singular approach. It has to be counteracted by an understanding of the pluralities of intersectional experiences of gender-based violence, just as Anne was pointing out earlier here today. The tensions that we're facing when using a survivor-centered approach they're multi-layered and they're really important to address. And I think, trying to measure different experiences of gender-based violence it's not impossible, but it's really tricky because you tend to narrow the scope always when you develop surveys because of the multitude of violences and abuse being, almost impossible to include in a survey. So this was the preamble for doing the Swedish survey. And as you can see, and this is a lot of information on this screen, but when developing a survey, you tend to face quite the same processes as we did in the UniSAFE survey. You start out by identifying different scales and items to be used, and you screen these, and you try to develop specific items using experiences by other researchers. And then you end up looking into different variables and background categories, sex, age, country of birth, and so forth. And I think Anne was also speaking of this quite poignantly on the problems you face. You have the language issues, trying to develop different versions of a survey for different groups, but also translational problems. And then the whole process of actually developing a survey implies several steps where a survivor-centered approach could be really important. And I'm just reflecting on, in the Swedish example, we needed an ethics approval from the agency in Sweden, and we didn't actually touch upon the survivor-centered aspects at all, but still got an ethical approval. I think that is really interesting in this situation. And just to imagine the large scale of the Swedish study, we had 125,000 surveys sent out and almost 39,000 responses collected. So it was also, in comparison to the UniSAFE survey, quite similar. Now, reflecting on all this work, both in Sweden and in the UniSAFE project, I think one important aspect of the survivor-centered approach is thinking through how to screen existing scales and measures and items from this perspective. And then using feminist research perspectives, as we have done, this implies a process of developing and trying to measure and capture what I think you was mentioning, Claudia, the always already known volume of gender-based violence as an autotelic, imminent, often lifelong and common experience among the majority of women and minorities in our institutions. We are facing a survey development process which will not lead to, displaying all these experiences. And although I would argue that finding out that nearly 2 out of 3 respondents of the UniSAFE survey had experienced gender-based violence. This was quite the same in the Swedish study. We found out that more than half of the female PhD students had experienced sexual harassment in some sense. This is at least an important contribution, making visible the thorough and I would say far-reaching and ongoing normalization and neutralization of sexual harassment and gender-based violence in our institutions. Now, I can also reflect on some important paradoxes or challenges within a research group doing survey research of this kind, and that is the tension that develops within a research setting which is on, more or less consciously bringing out our own experiences of gender-based violence as part of a research group. I think this has not been an outspoken strategy in the UniSAFE context, but it was in the Swedish context, where we were developing perspectives grounded in our own experiences as researchers, as feminist researchers, and this actually produced an awarding, empowering research process in itself, but of course also led to a lot of conflicts in our research group. Now, these are just, reflections from the standpoint I'm at this place in the short version. But 2 things I want to have as key takeaways. I think we used theories on the normalization of gender-based violence as a way of developing items, and this meant pinpointing the importance of using the understanding of specific early phases of gender-based violence when developing items on specific forms of, for example, coercive behavior or identifying the gray zone psychological forms of violence. But also, as in the Swedish example, we actually had a group of respondents testing the survey, and they had explicitly declared they had experiences of sexual harassment, and their input really turned into changing the way we used different words, actually the language used in the survey, also how we included both directed and non-directed behaviors of sexual harassment in the survey. So yeah, my minutes are gone, Anke. In conclusion, I think it's been really an ongoing learning process in both these survey development processes on gender-based violence, which I think is so important to document and to reflect on further, because we need to continue co-create measures for gender-based violence in our institutions. We have not finished the work, although UniSAFE had taken a really important step in this sense. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Fredrik. Thanks to all 3 speakers. We now have some 3 minutes left. I'm sorry. For questions from the audience here in the room, but also online. And while we're waiting for people online to... excuse me? Yes? I'm sorry. Thanks. While we're waiting for people online to go to Slido and type in the code, I'd like to open the floor first for questions here from the audience. I have questions too, but there's one. Can you please say your name and where you're from? Actually, it's 2 questions.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you so much for the kind presentations. I have a very maybe naive question. What would be the time desired to fill in the questionnaire, the survey? When is, let's say, surveys that you can fill in anonymously online, what would be the desired time to do it for a person who is doing that?
Do we have another microphone down here, actually, or not? No. Okay, so what was the fill-in time? So maybe you can respond.
Okay, thank you. I just start. Time. Well, that's a really good question. We basically developed a survey more or less in half a year. I would say you could definitely spend more time on it, more time also to test it. It definitely depends, I'd say, if you want to use measurements that are already out there. And I think it continues that more and more people develop validated measurements. We, for example, I can recommend a UniSAFE questionnaire. If you use that, then you don't need that much time. But if you want to include new dimension, I would say definitely at least 6 months. Yeah.
So, but there's a lot of documentation on these processes, on development surveys. So I think you can, have some shortcuts in that sense. But still, if you incorporate new items, you need to translate them, back-translate them. You have to validate them. You have to test them. It's it's really a tough process that needs time, and you shouldn't rush it because it's so important that we develop items that really target the specific experiences that we're asking for. So, yeah.
Thank you. More questions from the audience there. Louise, I just.
Hey, I'm Katarzyna from Jagiellonian University, and I have a question to Vilana, because I guess RPOs are very well aware that surveys on gender-based violence are necessary for them to obtain knowledge, and what are benefits for research-performing organization when it comes to gathering evidence from individual interviews? What organizations have in this kind of collecting of data?
Of course, it can serve even as a monitoring instrument. For example, when there are certain policies implemented, there are some instruments, protocols, so on. So, like having individual interviews, it could be seen what goes on and what are the problems, what are the challenges. And collecting from individuals, we also can collect, where the problems are, but also to see how the policies are missing certain aspects. For example, intersectionality, as it was already mentioned so many times. And we can see that very often that the policies that cover, gender-based violence, certain measures, but intersectionality is missing. So, having those life experiences, life stories will give the institutions more information how to improve their policies.
Okay, we'll take one question from online before.
Yes, we take an online question. Thanks for that. Thanks for your active involvement online also. So the question is, what do the interviews disclose about the prevalence and manifestation of gender-based violence against a person with diverse identities? So touching upon the intersectionality aspects. And actually, I think this is a question I would like to hear from all three of you, because it's different types of data collection and different experiences. And then there's, I think, one more question from up there, and I'd like to close the panel then, because we're already 4 minutes into the coffee break, and there will be time for people in the audience to discuss more actually during the coffee break, if that's okay.
So if I can start, so of course that the data from the individual interviews, it gives the life experiences. What does it mean? How this violence is performed, or this power abuse is manifested when you have different socio-demographic and also functional diversities. So, on the one hand, it gives how this, for example, gender and race intersect, and then we see that more racial, sometimes discrimination is at the universities. And the pain of, this harm for the people are done because of universities are not taking seriously this intersectional approach. It's very heartbreaking, and I think, having this evidence, it is very good for the universities to improve their measures in terms of 7 Ps. Prevention, protection, prosecution, and other Ps.
Thank you. I think in contrast to the interviews, a survey data collection allows to take rather a look at the extent of prevalence of gender-based violence in different groups, in different intersectional groups. And it also, I'd say as a second point, it allows anonymity, which in interviews, of course, the people stay anonymous, but still might be feeling a bit more difficult to come out and talk about it. And a survey kind of allows you to completely freely enter your responses. I think that's an essential part.
Thanks, Claudia. And then I would add the importance of screening through service the consequences of gender-based violence, which also will have intersectional dimensions that you miss out on with the prevalence perspective. So it's important to also map the consequences, and that could be combined with interviews, because we need to look into the, for example, the racist and sexist consequences for different groups. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. We wrap up here.
Yes.
And I hand over to, I thank actually all of my colleagues, all three of you, for coming here today and sharing your reflections on learning experiences, on data collections. And I hand over to Colette.
No worries, I won't be talking much more. Just simply invite you to go and have a cup of coffee and go through the recommendations, look at the posters, and talk to each other. Meet you here
we
again.
had a few more questions, but we promised for the other questions to have the opportunity to speak with our speakers during the break.